Tong ketinggalian kali gitu cara rahang lawan ah. Waktu dokumentasi dikirim kembali lawan dokumentasi situasi terakhir didoakan ke Pak Yesus sehat segera baik gitu apa nam ganti. Amin ya rabbal alamin. Demikian Kang Haji sami-sami Kang Haji juga sehat lawan amin. Nuhun. Diantos.
There's something wonderfully grounding about being here with you all again, in this little corner of the internet where we can set aside the noise and sink into the quiet thrill of dissecting cinema. Not in the hurried way the world often pushes us to, but with the kind of patient, layered conversation one might have over coffee with an old friend. Welcome, my dear literature enthusiasts, the kind of people who see films not just as moving pictures, but as a kind of living text, full of metaphors waiting to be unpacked, structural rhythms to be admired, and moral undercurrents to be wrestled with. If you enjoy these deep dives, where we wander through the alleys of subtext, linger on the poetry of a single shot, and get lost in the interplay between narrative and theme, then I'd be honored if you'd like and subscribe, not as a formality, but as a way to keep the shared dialogue alive. Before we begin, I want to make something clear. This isn't conventional review, and it isn't concerned with box office performance or star ratings. This is a theoretical and critical exploration, built for minds that love pulling at threads to see how a story holds together. It's a study in texture, in mood, in the conversation between plot and philosophy. The story we're about to explore is War of the Worlds, 2025. And while what I'm offering here is not a factual critique of an actual release, it is a rich, imagined dissection meant to satisfy the part of you that delights in peeling away the skin of a narrative to see the clockwork underneath. I still remember the first time the title passed across my radar. It carried with it a strange double weight. Both the echo of H.G. Wells' classic alien invasion novel and the cinematic heritage of earlier adaptations. I felt that familiar, restless curiosity, the kind that sits just behind your ribs, whispering, what new angle will they find? What fresh anxiety will it dig up in me this time? I've always been fascinated by how alien invasion stories aren't really about aliens. They're about us. They strip away the scaffolding of our daily lives and reveal what's been underneath the whole time. Fear, love, greed, loyalty, cowardice, courage, sometimes all in the same breath. The film opens not with chaos, but with stillness, something I find deeply effective. The streets are quiet, skies an overcast gray, the camera lingering on details you might otherwise overlook, a half-drunk coffee cooling on a cafe table, the hum of distant electrical wires, the lazy drift of a plastic bag across an empty intersection. It's in these kinds of beginnings that my heart feels most at home, the unspoken promise that something is about to rupture the stillness, and when it does, the shift will feel seismic. We are introduced to the human world not through explosions or grand speeches, but through these intimate fragments of life. It makes the later disruption all the more jarring, like watching a painting burn. The narrative follows a handful of characters rather than a single protagonist, each orbiting the others in ways that feel both deliberate and organic. There's a radio host whose voice is calm and measured on the airwaves, but whose personal life is fraying in silence. A teenage girl who documents everything on an old camcorder, as though recording the world might keep it from changing. An astrophysicist who's been warning of cosmic anomalies for years, laughed off by her peers until first signs arrive. The film weaves between them with a kind of literary elegance, letting the audience inhabit their inner lives before the skies open. When the first sign does come, it's not fire or thunder. It's sound, a low, resonant hum that you can feel in your bones, as though the planet itself has begun to sing in a key we don't recognize. I remember leaning forward in my seat at that moment, not because I wanted to see more, but because I wanted to feel more. The sound design here, deep, tactile, and unsettling, reminded me of the way certain novels can make you feel a presence in a room without describing it outright. It was less about fear and more about inevitability. As the plot unfolds, events tighten like a spiral, drawing the characters together while the world around them unravels. City centers empty, rural communities barricade themselves, governments stammer through hollow reassurances. And in the middle of it, the question that every invasion story eventually asks, directly or indirectly: what does it mean to be human when the structures that define humanity collapse? I won't unravel the key twist just yet, but I will say this. The film plays a long game with its reveals. It plants seeds in small, easily overlooked moments: a flicker of static in a radio host's signal, a strange shadow in the girl's camcorder footage, a cryptic calculation the astrophysicist scrawls on a diner napkin, that only later bloom into full significance. Watching it felt like reading a novel where the foreshadowing is so skillfully woven in that you don't recognize it until it's already reshaped the narrative. One of the most powerful aspects of this story is how it balances the enormity of its premise with the intimacy of its emotional beats. Yes, there are massive set pieces, towering machines striding over burning cities, blinding bursts of light that render the night sky almost unfamiliar. But the real heartbeat of the film is in the quieter moments. The father holding his son's hand under a table while the walls shake. The radio host choosing to keep broadcasting even when she knows no one might be listening. The astrophysicist watching her old calculations dissolve into irrelevance as the rules of physics seem to bend. There's a turning point, lay enough in the film that it catches you off guard, where one of the characters discovers that the invasion isn't simply an attack, it's a form of communication, though one we can barely comprehend. This is where the story shifts from survival to interpretation, and where the thematic spine of the film becomes clearest. It isn't about us versus them. It's about what happens when we're forced to recognize that we are not the axis around which the universe turns. For me, this is where the film tapped into something deeper than spectacle. It brushed against a humbling terror of cosmic insignificance, something that's always resonated with my own worldview. The ending isn't neatly tied up, and I love that about it. It leaves space for unease, for lingering questions, for the kind of post-film silence where you find yourself staring at the credits, replaying moments in your mind, unsure if you're unsettled or enlightened. It's that ambiguity that makes me want to return to it. Not for answers, but for the experience of wrestling with it again. And so, what I hope to do in the deeper analysis to come is to peel back each of these narrative layers. The way the film constructs dread without resorting to cheap jump scares, the elegance of its parallel character arcs, the tension between its philosophical questions and its visual spectacle. There's so much to unpack, from the smallest details in set design to the way a single shot can hold both beauty and horror in the same frame. But more than anything, I want to explore how the story uses its alien premise to hold up a mirror to us, not to what we think we are, but to what we become when we're stripped bare. If you stay with me for this journey, we'll travel through every one of those layers. For now, consider this a door left ajar, with the promise that beyond it lies not just a film, but text worth reading with the care we usually reserve for novels. And like any great novel, it's one that reveals more the longer you sit with it. It begins not with the crash of metal or the glare of spotlights, but with a sky so still it feels staged. That kind of gray where the clouds seem to be holding their breath. There's a softness to the air, an almost imperceptible hum in the background. Though at first you could write it off as the machinery of the city, or maybe the tinnitus of too much silence. The streets are sparsely populated, not empty enough to alarm you, but just enough to make you notice every single movement. A man adjusts his coat collar against a wind that hasn't yet arrived. A cafe owner wipes the same patch of countertop twice. A boy on a scooter pauses at an intersection where no cars pass. The camera, patient and unhurried, leads us to a cramped radio station tucked into the upper floor of an old building. Inside, the host leans into his microphone, his voice low and steady, the kind of tone that makes you think everything is going to be fine even when it's not. On air, he's talking about the odd interference reports coming in from different counties, bursts of static, inexplicable pauses in transmission, strange tonal shifts in regular programming. Off-air, though, his eyes flick toward the silent phone on his desk more than once, the weight of unanswered calls pressing into his posture. Not far from there, we meet a teenage girl carrying an old camcorder that looks like it's been pulled from the back of a closet. She films compulsively, almost reflexively. Friends in the schoolyard, the flicker of sunlight off a chain-link fence, a neighbor's dog barking at an empty patch of air. There's no agenda to her recording, not yet, just a habit of holding on to things before they vanish. Her footage often wavers between focus and blur, but her eyes never do. She sees everything. In a dimly lit observatory on the outskirts of town, an astrophysicist sits hunched over her workstation, a mug of coffee gone cold beside her. For months, she's been tracing unusual readings in deep space, signals that don't match any known pulsar patterns or atmospheric anomalies. She's tried to raise alarms before, but they were always met with polite dismissal, the kind that carries more condescension than disagreement. Tonight, however, the data spikes in a way that refuses to be ignored. She prints out the readings, the paper curling hot from the machine, and starts to scrawl equations in the margins, chasing a thought that hasn't fully formed. The first shared thread between them comes quietly, a hum, not loud, not dramatic, but deep, resonant, like something stirring the marrow of the planet. At the radio station, it bleeds into the host's signal, sending faint tremors through his voice. On the girl's camcorder, it registers as a thin, quivering line in the audio track, distorting laughter into something hollow. In the observatory, the astrophysicist feels it before she hears it, a pressure in her ears that makes her pause mid-equation. It happens again the next day, and the day after that. Each time, the hum lingers a little longer. Each time, it's followed by subtle disruptions. Lights flicker without cause, animals turning in unison toward the sky, cell towers dropping service in brief, synchronized intervals. The film doesn't rush these developments. It lets the tension breathe, the way a good novel might spend a whole chapter letting you smell the smoke before showing you the fire. One morning, the teenage girl notices something in her footage from the night before, a flicker of movement in the corner of the frame, high in the sky, just at the edge of visibility. It's so faint she replays it 10 times, unsure whether it's real or an artifact of her camera's aging lens. Across town, the radio host receives his first live call about the phenomenon. A truck driver swearing he saw a glint overhead while driving the night route. He laughs it off on air, because that's part of his job, but his hand lingers over the call log longer than it should. Meanwhile, the astrophysicist tries to map the hum's frequencies against her earlier cosmic data. What she finds unsettles her. The sound aligns with patterns from her deep space readings, not random, not terrestrial, but repeating in intervals too precise to be natural. She emails her findings to a colleague overseas, only to receive an automated reply that their lab is under restricted access due to technical disruption. The first public rupture happens at a football game. Midway through the second quarter, the hum swells without warning, so strong that it rattles the bleachers. The players freeze mid-play. The scoreboard flickers, then dies. Phones go dark in the crowd. For a few seconds, the air feels thick enough to touch, and then it stops as abruptly as it began. The field falls into a stunned silence broken only by the sound of someone dropping a soda cup, its fizz unnaturally loud in the absence of all else. After that, the atmosphere changes. News outlets run cautious reports about localized signal disruptions and atmospheric anomalies. Social media brims with shaky videos of streetlights pulsing in rhythm with the hum. Some people make jokes, others post conspiracy threads. In the quieter corners of the world, unease sinks its roots. The radio host, restless, begins staying at the station after hours, combing through archives of past broadcasts to see if this has ever happened before. In one reel from decades ago, he finds something strange, a faint, Similar hum buried in the background of a weather report, almost identical in tone but shorter in duration. The date on the reel is from long before he was born. The teenage girl starts interviewing neighbors with her camcorder, asking if they've heard the sound. Most say yes, but dismiss it as weird power lines or just the wind. One elderly woman, though, insists she heard the same thing as a child, right before the lights in the sky. The girl doesn't know what to make of it, but she keeps recording. At the observatory, the astrophysicist receives her first reply from the overseas colleague, a single, encrypted message that reads, "They're here early." No context, no signature. She tries to send a follow-up, but her connection drops each time she hits send. And then comes the night of the blackout. No storm, no warning. Just a rolling wave of darkness spreading across the horizon, swallowing towns and cities alike. The hum pulses in perfect rhythm with the wave. From the window of the radio station, the host watches as the street lamps below go dark one by one. The teenage girl films a moment from her bedroom window, her own lights flickering out mid-recording. The astrophysicist, halfway through charting a new signal, stares at her dead monitor as the observatory falls silent. In the pitch-black quiet that follows, the first shape appears. Not in full. Not yet. Just a faint outline of something impossibly large against a clouded sky, its edges glinting with a cold, alien light. It moves slowly, deliberately, like it knows there's no need to hurry. The outline in the clouds lingers, a silhouette that refuses to resolve into anything familiar. People emerge from their homes and apartments, some in slippers, some barefoot, each one drawn by the same magnetic pull of curiosity and dread. The blackout stretches in every direction, an ocean of shadows swallowing street corners, storefronts, and landmarks alike. It's the kind of dark that feels older than electricity, older than human settlement, the kind where sound itself seems reluctant to travel. The teenage girl keeps filming, her camera's night vision struggling to hold on to detail. Through the viewfinder, the shape becomes clearer, not a single object but a cluster of them, arranged in a pattern that feels intentional, like constellations made solid. They hover without motion, without sound. For a long moment, nothing happens, and then a line of light slices through the sky, impossibly thin, impossibly precise, touching down somewhere far beyond the visible horizon. The hum follows, low and steady, vibrating to the soles of shoes and the roots of teeth. Miles away, the radio host sits at his desk, headset on, though the station has been off-air since the blackout began. He's recording into an analog reel-to-reel, his insurance against the digital silence that has swallowed everything else. His voice trembles just slightly as he describes what he sees from a window. The hovering forms, the pinpoint lights, the way the air seems to press in on itself. Halfway through a sentence, a burst of static erupts in his headphones. Not random noise, but a sequence of tones, almost like a coded message. He leans forward, straining to catch every pitch and pause, knowing instinctively that this is not meant for him, but that doesn't make it any less urgent. At the observatory, the astrophysicist works by flashlight, scribbling furiously into a notebook. The signal she's been tracking has shifted again, now perfectly aligned with the intervals of the hum. More unsettling still, the direction of origin has changed. It's no longer coming from deep space. It's coming from above the atmosphere, directly over their region. The acceleration is unprecedented, and she realizes with a cold clarity that the timeline she thought they had is gone. Then the first contact, though calling it contact feels inadequate. In the middle of an empty intersection, a shape materializes in the flicker of a half-dead street lamp. It's tall, skeletal in outline, but its surface shifts constantly, as though it's being redrawn moment by moment. It doesn't walk so much as glide, every movement smooth enough to unsettle the human eye. People gather at a cautious distance, phones useless in their pockets, unsure whether to run or watch. The teenage girl edges closer, her camcorder steady despite her breathing. When the figure turns, if turning is even the right word, its face blooms with point of light arranged in spirals, not eyes exactly, but something like attention. Across the city, similar apparitions appear, each one standing perfectly still, like markers planted in the earth. They don't speak, they don't attack, they simply are. The absence of violence makes their presence even more unnerving. as though they're measuring something, waiting for an alignment only they can detect. The radio host, still recording, realizes a sequence of tones in his headphones is repeating. He begins scribbling them down phonetically, the paper filling with strange symbols that feel half musical notation, half language. Every so often, a new tone slips in, disrupting the pattern, and each disruption coincides with a faint flicker in the lights overhead. He wonders, half terrified, half awed, whether the disruptions are responses. The astrophysicist makes a breakthrough, cross-referencing the hum's frequency with seismic readings from the blackout's onset. She discovers a lattice of resonances spreading through the Earth's crust. It's not random. It's a map, a network of points connecting beneath cities, rivers, and mountains. The apparitions aren't placed arbitrarily. They're standing directly above these nodes. The realization chills her. Whatever is happening isn't just in the sky. It's inside the planet. Night deepens. The air grows warmer, though the wind is still. The teenage girl, unable to tear herself away, films as one of the towering figures raises a limb. Not a hand, not exactly, and touches the ground. The motion is gentle, almost reverent, but the effect is immediate. A shockwave of light travels along the street, disappearing into the distance faster than sound. For a moment, she thinks she can hear whispers riding on the hum, but when she rewinds the tape, they're gone. That's when the ground moves. Not a violent quake, but a rolling shift, like the entire city is floating on something restless. Windows rattle. Distant car alarms stutter into life and die again. And from far beyond the horizon, a deep, resonant answer comes. Not a hum this time, but something lower, older, like the groan of the earth itself. The figures all turn in unison toward the source. The radio host recording cuts abruptly to silence. For a few seconds, nothing. Then the sound of his own breathing quickened. "It's not them," he whispers, as if to himself. "It's something else. They're not alone." The astrophysicist, flipping through her notebook, sees the map in a new way. The lattice of resonances isn't just beneath the earth. It's through it, threading into the oceans, connecting to points she recognizes as ancient impact sites. This isn't the first time. Whatever's happening now has happened before, long enough ago to be swallowed by myth. Suddenly, light floods the sky. Not daylight, not firelight. Something colder, sharper, bending shadows into impossible shapes. The hovering clusters above the city shift formation for the first time, descending slowly, impossibly large now that their scale can be measured against the skyline. From each one, smaller shapes detach, streaking downward like spears tipped in silver. The hum rises with them, no longer steady but urgent, a pulse accelerating towards some unknown threshold. People run now, not because they've been attacked, but because the air itself feels charged to breaking. The teenage girl keeps filming even as she moves, her footage jerking with each step, the image catching fragments of the descent, flashes of mirrored surfaces, glimpses of structures that seem both mechanical and alive. She trips once, scraping her knee, but doesn't stop. The first spear-like object strikes the ground at one of the mapped nodes. There's no explosion, just a bloom of light that spills upward in slow, curling tendrils. Where it touches buildings, metal ripples like water. The figures glide toward the light, their forms refracting in its glow. It's not destruction, not exactly. It's transformation and it's spreading. The radio host leaves his post for the first time in hours, reel-to-reel still spinning behind him. He takes the stairwell two at a time, stepping out into a street bathed in the alien glow. The tones in his head seem louder now, as if they've left the wires and taken root in the air around him. He sees people staring up, mouths slightly open, faces caught between awe and terror. The astrophysicist drives toward the nearest node, her car cutting through streets emptied by panic. When she arrives, the transformation is already underway. Trees near the site have grown taller, leaves thick and iridescent. The ground is patterned with glowing filigree, spiraling outward from the spear's point of impact. In the center of it all, one of the towering figures waits, silent but not inert, its spiral of lights shifting slowly, as though acknowledging her. The hum peaks. A deep vibration runs through every structure, every body, every grain of soil. And then silence. The hovering clusters dissolve upward, vanishing into clouds without so much as a shadow. The figures on the ground fade, their forms unraveling into the air like smoke. The light lingers a moment longer, then contracts inward, disappearing into the nodes as if it had never been. Power returns in waves. Street lights flicker back to life. Phones chime with notifications. Screens glow in windows. But nothing is quite the same. The transformed sites remain, pockets of altered reality embedded in the ordinary landscape. Some pulse faintly at night. Others hum softly, just at the edge of hearing. The teenage girl replays her footage over and over, catching details she missed in the moment. Patterns in the light, shapes in the clouds, the fleeting suggestion of movement in the spaces between the figures. The radio host listens to his recording, mapping the tones into a sequence that, when played back, almost resembles a melody. The astrophysicist, staring at her map, circles the nodes that remain dormant, knowing they won't stay that way forever. No explanation comes. No one claims responsibility. No government steps forward. No voice from the sky offers meaning. What remains are questions, changes, and the unshakable sense that the world has been shifted on its axis, tilted toward a future that doesn't quite belong to humanity alone. And in that quiet and the long, uneasy calm after the hum, each of them, girl, host, scientist, feels the same truth. Whatever visited wasn't finished. It was only the beginning. The teenage girl's name is Mara, though in the footage that spread afterward, she was rarely identified. Her camera work became the spine of the story for many people, not because it was the clearest or the most cinematic, but because it was stubbornly human. She didn't flinch when the world tilted into the surreal, at least not in a way that stopped her from recording. In the moments when others would have dropped everything and run, she adjusted the focus. This didn't come from bravery in the conventional sense. Mara had grown up in a household where stillness was never safe, where chaos was a default background noise. So her instinct was to keep moving toward the source of disruption until she understood it. The blackout was just another storm to step into. She wasn't popular, wasn't someone with a crowd of friends to rally around. That anonymity made her less visible in the chaos, allowed her to slip through places where attention could have been dangerous. Watching her footage, you notice that she gravitates toward the edges of things, filming not the main spectacle but the people watching it, their shifting expressions, the way their bodies lean forward or back in sync with the hum. It's only later that you realize how much of the truth was caught in those peripheral glances. Mara's view of the world was always through the edges, always in relation to something else. Then there's Cal, the radio host. His voice had been a constant in the city for years, the kind of late-night sound people trusted without knowing the man behind it. On the air, he was quick-witted, a little sardonic, with a knack for weaving in old records that seemed to comment on the night's news without saying it outright. Off-air, he lived alone in a small apartment above a laundromat, the walls lined with second-hand books and vinyl he'd never gotten around to alphabetizing. When the blackout came, he didn't go outside, not because he was afraid, but because he believed he could reach more people by staying put and documenting what he heard. Cal had a deep mistrust of spectacle. He'd seen too many moments turned into commodities, too many genuine events reduced to hashtags before they were even understood. That's why, when the tone began in his headset, he reached for the reel-to-reel instead of his phone. Analog tape didn't crash, didn't buffer, didn't betray you by uploading before you were ready. Listening back later, you can hear the shift in his breathing. The moment curiosity became dread, the moment dread became obsession. By the end, he wasn't recording for an audience anymore. He was recording for the future, for someone who might understand. And then there's Dr. Ileana Rourke, the astrophysicist. Her colleagues often describe her as both precise and impatient, a combination that made her brilliant in the lab and difficult in committees. She spent years mapping faint, repetitive signals from deep space, the kind most people dismissed as cosmic background noise. The blackout was, in her mind, a message of a different kind, one impossible to ignore. She approached it the way she approached everything, with rigorous analysis first, but an undercurrent of personal stake she rarely admitted. Ileana had grown up on the outskirts of a coastal city, where the nights were clear enough to see the Milky Way stretched like a seam overhead. Her father would tell her stories about lights in the sky, Not UFO stories exactly, but folk tales about things that live between the stars. When she was 12, she decided to become a scientist, not to prove him wrong, but to understand the language behind his myths. That same drive kept her at the observatory after the power died, flashlight in hand, mapping resonances no one else had yet noticed. To her, the events were not an intrusion but a conversation. The three of them, Mara, Cal, and Ileana, never met during those nights, though their paths crossed in ways none of them realized at the time. A frame in Mara's footage shows Cal leaning out of his window, headset still on. Cal's recorded tones match a pulsar light that appears in Ileana's seismic data. These overlaps aren't coincidences. They're threads in a net none of them saw forming. Mara's character is the one most grounded in instinct. She reacts quickly, makes decisions based on feel rather than data, but her choices are rarely reckless. Her background taught her that paying attention was a survival skill, and she uses that skill without romanticizing it. The danger doesn't thrill her, it sharpens her. When she watches a towering figure at the node, she isn't frozen by its alienness. She's cataloging it, piece by piece, as if memorizing a face she might need to recognize later. Cal, by contrast, is anchored in language, even in the middle of upheaval. His instinct is to narrate, to put the ungraspable into words. This is both his strength and his blind spot. He can sometimes mistake description for understanding. Yet that same urge to articulate keeps him from slipping into fear entirely. The tones he writes down may never be translated, but the act of writing them is an act of resistance against meaninglessness. In his mind, nothing is unrecordable if you try hard enough. Ileana's drive is precision, while Mara moves toward the unknown, and Cal speaks into it. Ileana dissects it. Her notes are meticulous, her diagrams drawn with the kind of care that suggests she believes accuracy is a form of respect. But she's not immune to wonder. When she first realizes the resonances form a map, there's a moment, brief, unguarded, where she laughs aloud in the empty observatory. It's the laugh of someone who has been waiting her whole life for proof that the world is stranger than people admit. What's striking about these characters is how their individual strengths become essential lenses through which the event is perceived. Without Mara's instinct, we lack the raw, unfiltered human reaction. Without Cal's language, we'd lose the thread of interpretation that binds scattered experiences together. Without Ileana's precision, the patterns would remain invisible. Each one contributes to a composite understanding that none of them could achieve alone. And yet, their flaws are just as critical. Mara's focus on the edges sometimes makes her miss the center. Cal's need to narrate can slow his ability to act. Ileana's demand for precision can make her hesitant to move without full certainty. These limitations don't diminish them. They make them real, make their involvement feel like something that could happen to anyone who happened to be watching, listening, or calculating at the right moment. There's also the question of what each of them takes away from the experience. For Mara, it's a shift in how she frames a world. Not through a lens of danger, but through one of possibility. She doesn't stop filming after the figures vanish. Weeks later, she's still recording everyday life, convinced that the edges will tell her when the next shift is coming. For Cal, the experience is a reminder that his role isn't just a broadcast, but to archive. His tapes become something of a private library, organized not by genre, but by resonance patterns. And for Ileana, it's a confirmation that the line between myth and measurement is thinner than most believe. She continues her research, but now with the quiet certainty that the next signal might come from much closer than expected. These characters work because they're not constructed as heroes in the traditional sense. They don't save anyone. They don't stop the event. What they do is witness, each in their own way, and in a story like this, that act carries as much weight as action. They remind us that history, especially history that reshapes the world, is rarely recorded by those in control of it. It's caught in the margins, on unsteady tapes, in notebooks no one else thought to check. And perhaps that's why they stay with you. Not because they change the course of events, but because they let the events change them, and through them, change us. There are things about the making of this film that almost feel like they belong in the film rather than outside of it. Not the usual glossy press tour anecdotes, but stories with the same faint hum of oddity that ran through the finished work. a kind of quiet strangeness that clung to production from the first day cameras rolled. Even the crew, a practical bunch by nature, started calling it the signal, a shorthand for anything they couldn't explain but couldn't ignore either. The first instance happened during a night shoot on the edge of the desert. They'd built an entire section of road there, complete with fake utility poles, so they could control the look of the skyline. The air was dry, the wind almost still, perfect conditions for a clean audio take. And then, halfway through a long tracking shot, every single piece of battery-powered equipment on set flickered out for exactly 12 seconds. Not died entirely, just dimmed, as if somebody had pulled a thread of current to the whole place, and then let it go. The cameras kept rolling on internal backups, so the footage survived, but when they played it back, a faint pulse of light appeared on the horizon that none of the crew remembered seeing. It was a kind of anomaly you'd expect in the script, not on the set. The director insisted it was probably a quirk of the backup system, but the lighting team swore that kind of synchronized fade was impossible without deliberate programming. From that night on, more than a few of the crew carried old-school flashlights in their belts, just in case the signal returned. Another oddity, the casting of Mara. She wasn't the actress they'd planned to hire. The original role went to a young performer with a string of festival credits, but 2 weeks before production, she had to leave for personal reasons. The replacement casting call was rushed, held in a cramped warehouse office under fluorescent lights. Mara's actress arrived late, still wearing her part-time job uniform from a coffee shop across town. She didn't read the lines exactly as written. She shifted the rhythm, letting pauses stretch just a beat longer than expected. Something about it felt like she wasn't performing at all, but simply speaking to the room. The director later said it was the first time he believed the character could exist outside the page. She got the part on the spot, uniform and all. Then there was a sound issue, strange enough to spook even the most seasoned audio engineer. They'd been recording ambient desert noise for post-production layering, the kind of work that usually involves hours of stillness while the crew sits in the dark. The microphones were top grade, shielded against interference. And yet, on 3 separate nights, they picked up a low-frequency tone no one could trace to any source. It wasn't wind. It wasn't machinery. It had an almost melodic rise and fall, like breath through a hollow reed. When they analyzed the waveform later, they noticed it matched, almost exactly, the pitch pattern of one of the fictional signal tones in the script, tones that had been composed months earlier, before location scouting even began. Of course, these are the kinds of coincidences productions tend to generate if you look for them hard enough. But the crew noticed that the more they joked about the signal, the more small mishaps and oddities cropped up. One prop, an old analog reel recorder, kept appearing in the background of shots it wasn't supposed to be in, moved by unseen hands between takes. Nobody ever admitted to doing it. Some of the strangest moments happened not during filming, but between scenes. One evening, a group of extras wandered off during a meal break to explore the set's perimeter. They came back pale, insisting they'd seen lights moving in the far hills, almost in formation. The nearest road in that direction was miles away. A security check found nothing, but one extra quit the next morning, telling the coordinator only, "This isn't the kind of story you leave unchanged by." Inside the soundstage, strange coincidences stacked up too. The production designer kept a notebook of reference sketches for the alien structures, pages covered with looping geometric forms. Midway through the shoot, one of the grips brought in an old postcard he'd found at a flea market. On the back was a message in faded ink. On the front, an aerial photograph of crop formations from the 1970s. The shapes were uncannily similar to the ones in the designer's private notebook, down to the number of loops in the spirals. Neither could explain it, and the postcard ended up taped to the wall in the art department as a kind of talisman. Even the weather seemed to have its own ideas about the production. For a scene meant to take place in a dry, abandoned field, the forecast promised a cloudless day. Instead, a thin mist rolled in from nowhere, hanging low enough to obscure the horizon but not the actors. It gave the footage an otherworldly softness the cinematographer hadn't planned for but loved instantly. Later, checking satellite data, the team found no record of fog formation in that area on that day. Some facts were stranger in a quieter way. The film's key resonant sound, for instance, was built from layers of entirely unrelated recordings: a slowed-down whale song, the creak of an old wooden pier, the hum of fluorescent lights in an empty gymnasium. The sound designer blended them until none of the original sources were recognizable, but together they created something eerily close to the tones captured accidentally in the desert. When the actors heard for the first time during playback, more than one of them went quiet mid-sentence. There was also the matter of the missing frame. In one reel from the climactic scene, exactly one frame of film stock came back from the lab blank. Not black, just blank, as if light had never touched it. This wasn't digital dropout or exposure error. The lab technician, a veteran of 20 years, said he'd never seen anything like it. The frame sat between two perfect shots, both lit and focused identically. No one on set noticed it until months later in the edit suite, but the director decided to leave it in, saying it felt truthful to the story. And then there's a legend. Every production has one about the final night shoot. They'd wrapped the last wide shot just before dawn. The crew bone-tired, the air electric with relief. As they packed up, someone put a portable speaker on the hood of a truck, playing an old folk song about travelers and unreturned messages. In the half-light, a series of bright flashes lit up on the far ridge, 5 in total, evenly spaced and gone before anyone could get a camera pointed at them. The next day, the location was empty, no sign of equipment, no footprints in the dust. It might have been pranksters. It might have been something else. But among the crew, no one argued about whether it really happened. Trivia trickled out slowly after the shoot ended. One of the minor props, an antique pocket watch, had once belonged to a radio operator during World War II. The actor who used in the film claimed it always ticked slightly off rhythm during takes, but perfectly in sync between them. A background character's scarf, chosen at random from a costume bin, turned out to be handmade by a weaver from the very region where the fictional events took place. A camera assistant realized, halfway through production, that the number of takes for one recurring shot, always by chance, had landed on the same total, 7. Even months later, during the press junket, the cast and crew were still exchanging small, almost throwaway recollections. A certain street lamp that always buzzed louder when they were rolling. A photograph taped in the corner of the production office that no one remembered putting there. The way the local stray dog seemed to appear on the same day they filmed scenes about waiting. These are the kinds of details that never make it into the official histories of films. They're too slight, too strange, too easy to dismiss. But in the context of this particular story, they feel like fragments of the same larger puzzle. A reminder that even the process of pretending can pull you into something you can't fully explain. And maybe that's the truest thing about the production, that it left the people who made it with the same uneasy, electric curiosity as the audience who would eventually watch it. All right, let's sink into this one slowly, the way you will a novel you've been saving for a rainy afternoon, knowing you'll underline half the sentences and dog-ear every other page. Because for this film, the events aren't just things that happen. They're deliberate architecture. Every scene, every tonal shift, feels like it was laid down with a craftsman's patience and a poet's instinct for rhythm. The more I think about it, the more I realize this isn't a movie you simply watch. It's one you're slowly drawn into, as if the story itself is studying you back. What strikes me first, looking critically at the major events, is how they function less like plot checkpoints and more like tectonic plates, slow, grinding movements that suddenly produce an earthquake in an emotional landscape. Take the early sequence in which the first inexplicable tremors of something not right ripple through the world. On the surface, it's a familiar setup. People noticing things they can't explain. But here, the execution sidesteps cliché by rooting the moment in the ordinary. Instead of grand disaster shots, we get close, almost claustrophobic scenes of people experiencing small malfunctions in the systems they rely on, a streetlight stuttering, a commuter train pausing for exactly 17 seconds without explanation, a radio losing its signal mid-sentence. It's subtle enough to feel plausible, unsettling enough to prick at the part of your brain that keeps track of patterns. From a critical perspective, this is the film's first great gambit, choosing unease over spectacle. By refusing to explain too much in those early beats, the filmmakers give the audience the same fractured information the characters have. You're not told what's wrong. You're left to piece it together, your mind filling the gaps with far more unnerving possibilities than any single reveal could offer. It's a literary technique as much as a cinematic one. The equivalent of an unreliable narrator whose omissions are more telling than their words. The next significant event, and one I think will be argued about for years in classrooms and review columns alike, is the gathering at the edge of the ridge. On paper, it's a simple set piece, a group of people climbing a hill to see what's on the other side. But on screen, it's staged like a kind of secular pilgrimage. The camera doesn't rush. It breathes, watching characters from behind, letting the soundscape carry the tension. The crunch of boots on dirt, the creak of a pack strap, someone's breath catching just slightly too soon. When they crest the ridge, there's no explosion, no swarm of invaders, just a vast, silent expanse and a strange, unbroken line of light stretching across the horizon. This is where the thematic spine of the movie starts to reveal itself. The event isn't about danger in the traditional sense. It's about confrontation with the unknown and the human compulsion to approach it anyway. Critics often talk about negative space in visual composition, the emptiness that defines the shape of the subject. Here, the filmmakers use narrative negative space. What we don't see tells us just as much as what we do, and that absence becomes its own kind of presence. Then comes a midpoint shift, and with it, one of the film's most hotly debated scenes, the broadcast interruption. Halfway through a news segment, the screen fractures into static, and a sequence of tones plays, deliberate, measured, and somehow melodic. I've seen audience reactions split cleanly here. Some find it a masterstroke of minimalism, refusing to offer any image to accompany the sound, and letting the audience's imagination do the work. Others feel it's a tease without payoff, an artful dodge rather than a narrative risk. From my perspective, the genius of this moment is that it forces an uncomfortable intimacy. Deprived of visual spectacle, you're left alone with the sound. And because the sound feels intentional, it becomes almost confrontational, as if the unknown is now aware of you. What's remarkable is how this event reshapes the emotional atmosphere. Up until this point, the characters have been observers. The broadcast makes them participants. There's a quiet but palpable shift in body language, in the way conversations are filmed. People leaning in closer, lowering their voices, glancing towards silent devices, as if they might start speaking again. The event deepens a thematic thread about communication, perception, and the space between what is said and what is understood. One of the film's most affecting stretches comes later, in the aftermath of the city blackout. By itself, the loss of power could be played as a mere inconvenience or disaster cliché. But here, it becomes almost a character study. In one extended sequence, the camera drifts through small pockets of candlelit humanity, a woman mending a torn sleeve by hand, a child tracing patterns in the wax drips, a group of strangers sharing a jar of preserved peaches without speaking. These moments, while narratively quiet, are thematically loud. They remind you that the larger war is as much internal and relational as it is external. This isn't just about survival. It's about the ways we reconfigure our connections when the structures we take for granted collapse. From a critical lens, this section also underscores the filmmaker's refusal to give the audience an easy us versus them dynamic. The danger is impersonal, abstract, not a villain to be defeated, but a force to be understood, maybe even endured. This aligns a film with certain traditions in speculative fiction where the antagonist is less an individual and more an idea or inevitability. It's an approach that tends to divide audiences. Some crave a face of their fear. Others find it far more haunting when there isn't one. And then we arrive at the late film event that still lingers with me. The Return to the Ridge. It mirrors the earlier gathering but reframes it entirely. This time, the line of light is broken, scattered into points that seem to pulse in some kind of sequence. The crowd is smaller now. Faces thinner, eyes darker, but the posture is the same, that forward lean toward the unknown. The sound design here is extraordinary, folding in fragments of earlier tones, snatches of whispered dialogue, even a faint suggestion of a heartbeat that could belong to anyone or anything. What this moment says, on a thematic level, is profound. Curiosity and fear are not opposites but companions. We're drawn toward what unsettles us, even knowing it might undo us. The film's emotional resonance comes from precisely this interplay between yearning and unease. Each major event is a study in proximity, how close we dare to stand to the things we don't understand. The events don't resolve in traditional sense. They accumulate, layering image and sound and gesture until the emotional weight becomes undeniable. By the time the final scene unfolds, a quiet tableau that resists closure, you realize the events were never leading to a singular answer. They were leading to a particular state of mind. The film leaves you in that state, which is why its reception has been so varied. Some call it incomplete. Others call it hauntingly whole. To me, that split in reception is itself evidence of the film's success. It refuses to resolve into something neat enough to forget. What's fascinating is how the events also serve as a mirror for the audience's own interpretive habits. If you crave certainty, the film can feel evasive. If you're comfortable with ambiguity, it can feel revelatory. That's the beauty of approaching these moments critically. They aren't just there to move a story forward. They're there to invite a conversation between the film and the viewer, one that can continue long after the credits roll. And that, I think, is why these events matter beyond their narrative function. They embody the film's central truth, that the unknown isn't just something out there to be encountered. It's inside us, shaping how we see, how we connect, and how we decide whether to move toward a ridge or stay where it's safe. All right, let's wander behind the curtain for a while, not with the brisk efficiency of a journalist, but with the unhurried curiosity of someone poking through a friend's attic, finding old photographs and bits of paper with handwriting faded just enough to make you lean in closer. What fascinates me most about this film's creation is how much it feels like the product of careful planning and happy accidents living in the same house. On one hand, the production team had a meticulous vision, floor-to-ceiling storyboards, months of location scouting, a library of reference materials that could rival a small museum. On the other hand, some of the film's most resonant details emerged from moments that were quite literally unplanned. Take the first days of shooting. The production had chosen a real stretch of land for the ridge scenes, a place that seemed almost too cinematic to be real. The crew had scouted it in bright autumn light, when the grass was a dry gold and the horizon was a crisp, unbroken line. By the time the cameras arrived, though, a late-season storm had rolled through, turning the ground into a patchwork of mud and shallow puddles. Most productions would have delayed, waiting for the right look to return. Instead, the director made the choice to lean into it, reworking the shot list to use the wet, heavy atmosphere. Those reflective puddles became mirrors for the sky in several key shots, a touch that gave the ridge sequences an almost otherworldly quality. None of that was in the original plan. The crew told stories about those days with a mix of fondness and exhaustion. Apparently, there was one assistant camera operator whose boots got so stuck in the mud during a take that they had to abandon them entirely, finishing the scene in mismatched sneakers borrowed from a grip. The moment became an unofficial bit of crew lore, a reminder that no matter how high concept a film is, it's built on the very human reality of people standing in wet socks trying not to laugh during a take. The sound design, too, carries its own stories. Those haunting broadcast tones, they weren't entirely digital creations. The sound team actually recorded a custom-built, partially broken xylophone that had been rescued from a school storage closet. Its imperfect tuning produced this slightly wavering pitch that gave the tones their unsettling quality. You can hear it most clearly in the second broadcast sequence, layered under more synthetic textures. According to the lead sound designer, they spent 2 full nights experimenting with different mallets and striking techniques until they found a combination that made your stomach not just a little without knowing why. Cinematography had its share of experiments, too. The director of photography had a philosophy. If a scene was about uncertainty, the camera should be allowed to breathe like it was uncertain, too. This led to a lot of handheld work. Not the shaky, over-caffeinated style you see in action films, but subtler, almost subconscious drift. It's the kind of movement you don't register until you realize you've been leaning forward in your seat, unconsciously mirroring it. In some of the blackout scenes, they actually shot using only the practical light from candles and lanterns, pushing the camera sensors to their limits. That grain and softness you see in those moments isn't post-production magic. It's the real texture of light struggling to survive in darkness. One of my favorite behind-the-scenes anecdotes comes from the child actor in the candlelight sequence. Between takes, they apparently made a game out of creating little wax sculptures from the drips, something no one in the crew had anticipated. One of those sculptures, a tiny, abstract figure, ended up on a table in the background of a later scene, unnoticed by most viewers but cherished by the crew as a sort of secret signature. That's the kind of detail you can't plan for, but it becomes part of the film's soul. Even the costumes have stories embedded in them. The wardrobe department deliberately chose fabrics that would age and fray under real conditions instead of pre-weathering them artificially. That meant the actors were wearing clothes that were slowly, genuinely breaking down over the course of the shoot. Seams loosening, colors fading, patches forming where straps rubbed against shoulders. It's one of those decisions that costs more time and effort, but pays off in authenticity, especially when you notice, in the late film Ridge scene, that someone's coat is missing a button it had in an earlier sequence. That wasn't a continuity error. It was a tiny truth. The crew also spoke often about the director's insistence on silence rehearsals. Before filming certain key scenes, especially the ones heavy with unspoken tension, they'd run the scene once with no dialogue at all, just movement and expression. This wasn't about blocking or technical adjustments. It was about letting the actors find the rhythms of each other's presence without leaning on words. More than once, these silent rehearsals revealed moments that ended up in the final cut. A glance held a fraction too long, a hand hovering and then retreating, the quiet choreography of people thinking in the same space. As for the editing process, it was almost archaeological in nature. The editor described it as digging for fossils, starting with a whole massive dig site of footage and gradually uncovering the shape of the story underneath. Some of the most powerful sequences were discovered in post, when the juxtaposition of two unrelated shots suddenly created a new meaning. The edit of the second Ridge visit, for instance, originally had twice as many cuts. It wasn't until they stripped it down to fewer, longer takes that it gained that trance-like pull. There's also a charmingly human layer to the crew's experience. The rituals they built to keep morale up during what could have been a grueling schedule. One of these was First Light Coffee, where whoever was on the earliest call time would brew a massive pot of strong coffee and hand out in mismatched mugs they'd been collecting from thrift stores near each location. By the end of production, they had nearly 50 mugs, each with its own personality, floral patterns, sports logos, a chipped one shaped like a pumpkin. The mugs became a kind of traveling gallery, a reminder that filmmaking is, at its core, a collective act made up of small, shared comforts. And maybe that's a real thread running through all these production stories. The idea that a film isn't just the sum of its big artistic choices, but the accumulation of all these smaller, often invisible acts of care and invention. The puddles on the ridge, the cracked xylophone, the wax figurine, the fraying coats, the thrifted mugs. None of them were in the pitch deck or the marketing materials, but all of them are in the final work if you know where to look. When you watch the finished film, you might not consciously register these details, but you feel them. You feel the lived-in quality of the world, the slightly imperfect edges, the sense that what you're seeing isn't just a construction, but a lived experience caught on camera. And that's what separates a technically impressive movie from one that lingers in your bones. The invisible fingerprints of the people who made it, smudged across every frame. All right, let's step into the film's world, not like tourists with checklists of locations, but like old friends wandering through a dream we've half forgotten, yet somehow still know our way around. The places in the story aren't just backdrops. They're living, breathing presences that hold memory in their walls, that shape the rhythm of events the way a river shapes the stones it passes over. The first place you feel is the ridge. It's not named in the film, but it doesn't need to be. That low, sweeping rise of land feels ancient, like it's been keeping secrets long before the first character ever sets foot there. The grass grows in restless clumps, never lying flat, always shifting with the wind. When the light hits it right, early morning or the last goal of the day, it turns into a kind of velvet, rippling in slow, hypnotic waves. But the ridge isn't always so gentle. In the late scenes, when the clouds thicken and the air feels like it's holding its breath, it becomes something more austere. The horizon line is sharp, cutting the frame in two, and you can feel the weight of distance pressing down on every step. What's remarkable is how the ridge changes not because the camera tells you it's different, but because the story has changed inside you. The same wind, the same grass, yet it feels entirely different in those later moments. That's the power of setting woven tightly into the fabric of the narrative. It reflects the character's shifting internal worlds without a single word spoken. Then there's the farmhouse. If the ridge is the film's silent witness, the farmhouse is its beating heart. The boards are weathered, the paint long surrendered to the elements, yet there's a stubborn dignity in the way it still stands. Inside, the rooms are dim but warm, lit by windows that filter in light like it's something precious that can't be wasted. The set design here is genius. It's not cluttered, but every object feels like it belongs to the story. A coffee cup with a hairline crack. A wool blanket folded and refolded until it's almost square. A family photo in a frame, just slightly too big for it. These details tell you who lives here before they even speak. And the way the camera moves to the farmhouse, slow, deliberate pans that almost feel like someone breathing in the space, lets you feel its gravity. This isn't just where the characters live. It's where they retreat, where they argue, where they decide whether to stand their ground or run. The farmhouse holds those choices in its walls. Between these two anchors, the ridge and the farmhouse, there's the road. Ah, the road. It's not glamorous. It's cracked asphalt, faded lane paint, the kind of road you drive without thinking about until one day it's the only path you have left. Cinematically, it's used as connective tissue, stitching together the intimate spaces with the vast ones. But more than that, it's a space of transformation. The road scenes are where characters talk in fragments, where revelations slip out between silences, where the camera often lingers on passing landscapes just long enough for you to feel a shift coming. The road carries people from what they know into what they can't undo. Of course, the film doesn't live entirely in the open air. The interiors, especially the broadcast station, bring a very different texture. The station is cramped, full of the quiet hum of machines, the soft glow of outdated monitors. It's an entirely different palette from the farmhouse's warm browns or the ridge's golden green. Here, you get sterile blues, the occasional sickly green of an old fluorescent bulb, shadows that pool in corners like water no one has mopped up. The cinematography tightens here, shots framed through doorways, reflections caught in dusty glass, to give you the sense that even though you're inside, you're never entirely safe. One of the most haunting uses of setting happens in the marshland sequence. It's a short stretch of the film, but unforgettable. The water barely ripples. The reeds sway in ways that don't quite match the wind, and the sound mix lets in just enough of the world, distant birds, a soft splash you can't place, to make your skin prickle. The marsh is a place of suspension, where movement slows and time feels slightly wrong. The cinematographer plays with shallow focus here, letting parts of frame drift into softness, so your eye is never entirely certain where to rest. It's an almost subconscious way of saying, this place doesn't want you to understand it fully. Lighting is the invisible thread tying all these locations together. Early in the film, light is abundant but not overpowering. That kind of soft daylight you can almost taste in the back of your throat. As the narrative tightens, so does the light. Shadows lengthen, colors desaturate, and even daylight seems cooler, more fragile. By the time you reach the final sequences, light itself feels rationed. You're grateful for every glow, every reflection. The filmmakers didn't rely on artificial perfection, either. Much of the light was natural or practical. Candles, lanterns, sunlight through real windows, which means shadows fall imperfectly, the way they do in life. That imperfection is part of what makes the world believable. When a ridge is lit by nothing but the dying light of day, you believe it's happening in real time. Color grading plays a quiet but crucial role. The palette starts wide and warm, then narrows as the tension builds. Early scenes have rich earth tones, golds, browns, deep greens. As the story darkens, those colors drain into muted grays, pale blues, and the kind of green you only see in the underside of leaves on a storm day. By the final act, the color feels almost monochrome, but the shift happens so gradually you only realize it when you compare beginning to end. Camera movement is another character in this story. Wide, Steady shots dominate the ridge scenes, making you feel the expanse and the isolation. Inside the farmhouse, the camera moves closer, following characters in over-the-shoulder framings that make you feel like an invisible guest in the room. On the road, there's a subtle tracking that matches the vehicle's motion. You feel the vibration, the hum of tires, even when you're not consciously noticing it. And in the marshlands, the camera becomes almost float-like, gliding in ways that make you uneasy, as if you're not entirely in control where it's taking you. Sound design integrates with the settings so deeply it's almost part of them. The ridge carries wind that shifts from gentle to cutting. The farmhouse has a low creak, of which settling in the faint, irregular ticking of a clock in another room. The station hums with electricity, its silence never purer. And the marshland, well, the marsh breathes. That's the only way to describe it. There's a subtle inhaling-exhaling rhythm to the ambient noise there, like the place itself is alive. And here's something I love. The filmmakers weren't afraid to let the settings breathe without dialogue. Some of the most affecting moments in the film are those where nothing is said, where the camera just listens. To wind over grass, to rain on a metal roof, to the distant, almost forgotten sound of a train passing at night. These are the moments where the world feels bigger than the plot, reminding you that these places existed before and will exist after the story ends. By the end, you realize the settings have been telling a story all their own. The ridge teaches you about endurance. The farmhouse teaches you about shelter and choice. The road teaches you about the cost of leaving. The station warns you about the seduction of control. And the marsh reminds you that some truths are meant to stay partly hidden. Together, they form the emotional geography of the film, a map you can't fold up and put away, because part of you will always keep walking it. All right, let's slip behind the curtain for a while, not into the glossy press junket version of events, but into the heartbeat of the set, where stories live in the spaces between takes, and where the film we saw on screen was stitched together through countless moments that never made it to the final cut. The first thing I'll tell you is this. The set had a smell. Not a bad one, not a chemical tang or a dusty warehouse scent, but a living smell. It was part coffee grounds, part damp wool, part metal and earth, depending on the location. The ridge sequences, for instance, had this clean, crisp scent of grass mixed with the faint sweetness of wildflowers crushed underfoot. That's the sort of thing you never notice until you spend hours there, waiting for the right cloud to drift into place for a shot. The cinematographer once joked that the ridge smelled like a memory I hadn't had yet, and we all knew exactly what he meant. The crew worked like a family in the truest sense of the word. Not the perfect, postcard kind, but the messy, affectionate kind where everyone knows each other's quirks and works around them. The director had a habit of humming when thinking through a shot, low, tuneless, almost like he was talking to himself in music. The sound team learned to anticipate it and wouldn't even roll until he stopped, because that hum meant his mind was still editing the scene before it was captured. The actors found their own ways to keep the energy light. During the farmhouse scenes, they started a running game. One person had to slip a completely anachronistic object into background, a plastic toy, a modern coffee mug, without breaking the overall aesthetic. Of course, the script supervisor caught them almost every time, but not before they'd gotten a laugh out of it. One day, a bright blue rubber duck ended up sitting on the edge of the kitchen counter for 3 takes before anyone noticed. The director finally spotted it and didn't even yell. He just picked it up, squeezed it once, and handed it back with a grin. Not every day was lighthearted. Though, the marshland scenes were a logistical nightmare. That water was cold, even in the middle of summer, and it had this thick, silted bottom that sucked at your boots. Every step was a gamble. Would your foot come back up easily, or would you be wrestling the mud like a stubborn animal? The crew built narrow walkways out of planks with camera operators, but the actors had to wade in naturally for the shots. One of them later said it felt like acting in quicksand. To make things worse, there were biting insects, small, almost invisible, that left welts the size of coins. Between takes, the costume department was constantly dabbing makeup over fresh bites to keep continuity. But the marsh also gave us one of the best unscripted moments. During a particularly tense scene, the wind shifted just as a line was delivered, and a ripple moved across the water in perfect sync with the actor's words. It wasn't planned, but when they watched playback, Everyone went still. It was like the land itself had agreed with the sentiment. The director kept it in without a second thought. Whether it was both an enemy and a collaborator, the ridge, in particular, was at the mercy of the sky. They needed overcast light for certain sequences, soft, shadowless, almost like the world was holding its breath. But clouds move, and in open land like that, you can see them coming from miles away. The crew developed a silent communication system. The assistant director would stand with binoculars, scanning the horizon, while the lighting crew prepped to either bounce or block the sunlight, depending on what rolled in. When the sky lined up just right, there would be the sudden electric urgency. Cameras rolling, actors ready, no wasted breath. The farmhouse interiors were shot on a soundstage, but even there, they ran into odd challenges. The building was reconstructed using salvaged wood from actual rural homes to give it that lived-in authenticity, which meant it creaked like a real, aging house. Sometimes, the floorboards groaned louder than the actors' dialogue. The sound team eventually solved it by padding certain boards underneath with layers of cork, but it became a running joke. If you forgot where the quiet spots were, you'd end up a creak right in the middle of an emotional line. Between the intensity of filming, the cast had their own rituals. One of the leads, who had a background in theater, started doing warm-up exercises before emotional scenes. Not just of themselves, but inviting anyone on set to join. At first, only a couple people humored it, but by the final weeks, you'd see grips, makeup artists, and even the catering staff stretching and breathing together before a big take. It became this unspoken way of saying, we're in this together, which I think is why so much of the film feels cohesive, even when the scenes are wildly different in tone. There was also the infamous coffee incident. One early morning, just before sunrise, the crew was setting up for a road scene. The prop master had placed a travel mug in the vehicle for authenticity. The problem? It wasn't a prop. It was the assistant director's actual coffee, the one she'd been clinging to all morning. The actor took the first sip mid-take, stayed in character, but you could see the flicker in their eyes as they realized it wasn't empty. They finished the scene without breaking, which impressed everyone except the assistant director, who mourned her lost caffeine for the rest of the day. Filming the broadcast station sequences was an exercise in patience. The set was packed tight with old equipment, real vintage gear, much of it borrowed from collectors who insisted on its preservation. That meant the crew had to be careful moving through the space. Cables were taped down with precision, and only essential personnel were allowed inside during takes. The heat from the equipment was intense, so they had to take frequent breaks to cool the room without messing up the lighting continuity. Perhaps my favorite behind-the-scenes memory came during one of those breaks. The power had been cut to the set while they cooled it down, so it was dim and quiet. One of the younger crew members found an old vinyl record tucked into a corner and put it on a portable player. The sound was scratchy and perfect, and suddenly the whole cast and crew were just standing there, bathed in warm shadow, listening to this ghost of a song. For a moment, the divide between making the film and living inside it disappeared. Of course, not every challenge was poetic. There were budget constraints that forced last-minute rewrites. One particularly ambitious scene involving a crane shot over the ridge had to be scrapped when the rig malfunctioned. Rather than panic, the director reimagined the scene as a series of grounded shots with careful focus pulls, and it ended up being one of the most intimate moments in the entire film. That's the kind of adaptation you only get when necessity forces creativity. The cast chemistry off camera was as genuine as it appeared on screen. Even in heavier sequences, they managed to keep the atmosphere collaborative rather than tense. One of the supporting actors had a knack for deadpan humor and would quietly deliver a single absurd line between takes that left everyone, including the director, laughing under their breath. It never made it into the film, but it loosened the room in a way that showed in the performances. By the end of filming, the set had accumulated its own mythology. The ghost in the sound booth, a shadow that kept appearing on playback, later traced to a swinging mic cable. The cursed pair of boots. 3 people wore them in different scenes, and each time something went wrong. The magical thermos, left in the marsh overnight, and somehow came back dry inside. These are the kinds of things you can't write into a script, but that become part of the soul of the film. When they finally wrapped, There wasn't a grand orchestrated celebration, just a slow, collective exhale. The ridge stood silent in the fading light. The farmhouse was already half dismantled, and the marsh had reclaimed its stillness. But the people, cast, crew, everyone who had walked these spaces, carried them home in their bones. And maybe that's why, when you watch the film, the world feels so real. It's not just a place they built for us to see. It's a place they lived in, fought through, laughed in, and loved for the months it took to bring it to life. All right, then let's wade into the undercurrent, the part of film that doesn't so much speak to you as it hums beneath your skin. Because every frame here was built like a page from a novel, layered, deliberate, and full of quiet clues that reward you if you're willing to slow down and listen. The first thing you notice, though maybe not consciously, is that this is a story about distance. Not just a literal space between places, but the emotional and psychological distances we build between ourselves and others, between what we want to believe and what we dare to face. Characters are always framed with something between them. A fence post, a rain-streaked window, the curve of a hill. It's not an accident. The director wanted us to feel that gap, even in moments of connection, so that when those barriers do fall, even briefly, we feel the weight of it. There's also the recurring image of thresholds, doorways, bridges, gates, even the lip of a trench. Each one is a point of decision. You either cross and risk change, or you stay and preserve what's familiar. It's a simple visual device, but it works because the characters themselves are constantly hovering at emotional thresholds. You can see it in the way they pause before speaking hard truths, or in how they linger just outside a room before stepping in. Water is perhaps the most potent symbol here, and it's everywhere if you start looking for it. Not in the way a blockbuster might use water for spectacle, but as a quiet, restless presence. In the marshlands, it's murky, almost oppressive, a reflection of confusion and moral uncertainty. On the ridge after rainfall, it pools in small depressions, catching light in ways that feel almost hopeful. And during moments of emotional collapse, it's often raining, not in a melodramatic, thunderous way, but as a fine, persistent drizzle that seems to leach the color from the world. The message is there: water adapts, but also erodes. It changes what it touches, slowly and without mercy. Sound plays into the symbolism, too. The low hum of wind through the ridge grass, the faint trickle of a stream under dialogue. Even silence, those long, breathless pauses where you can hear only the environment, becomes a kind of thematic punctuation. It's the film's way of saying that nature, time, and truth will keep moving whether the characters are ready or not. Another recurring motif is the use of broken objects. A shattered clock on a farmhouse wall, a rusted weather vane stuck facing the wrong direction, a cracked mirror that distorts the reflection just enough to feel unsettling. These are more than set dressing. They're the film whispering that time, direction, and identity are never as fixed as we want them to be. For characters whose sense of self is already fragile, these visual cues act like subconscious nudges toward crisis. The most delicate thread, though, is the way the film uses light. Early scenes tend toward a muted palette, with light diffused through clouds, smoke, or old glass. As the narrative progresses, you start to see sharper contrasts. Bright, almost blinding light against deep shadow. It's not just a stylistic flourish. It's an echo of the moral clarity and danger that comes when the truth is finally faced head-on. By the climax, those extremes are at their most violent, as though the world itself is no longer willing to let anyone hide in half-light. Even the animals carry symbolic weight. There's a scene where a lone bird hovers over a field, seemingly indecisive about landing. You could miss it if you blink, but it mirrors the lead character's own hesitation to commit to a course of action. Dogs, meanwhile, are seen only in the background, barking from behind fences, running along ridges but never coming close. Loyalty and companionship are present in the world, but always just out of reach. Thematically, the film keeps circling back to the tension between survival and humanity. What are we willing to lose to protect ourselves? And at what point does that loss make survival meaningless? The plot gives us dramatic beats, desperate choices, sudden betrayals, fleeting alliances, but the real ache comes from the small moments. Someone sharing the last of their bread with a stranger, or pause and pick up a fallen photograph in the middle of chaos. These quiet acts remind us that even in the harshest circumstances, our instinct to care for one another is as stubborn as our instinct to endure. There's also a deep undercurrent about perception and truth. Several key moments hinge on characters seeing the same event differently, sometimes because of physical perspective, sometimes because of emotional bias. The camera plays into this by repeating certain shots later in the film, but from a slightly shifted angle, revealing details we missed the first time. It's a subtle reminder that reality is rarely objective, and that our understanding of events is shaped as much by who we are as by what actually happened. One of my favorite pieces of symbolism is so understated you might not catch it unless you're looking for it. The recurring appearance of the color red, but never in large swaths. A scarf, a single chair in a muted room, the handle of a tool. Red shows up at moments of transition, not always violent, but always decisive. It's as though the film is quietly marking the moments when something irreversible has shifted. The dialogue itself carries symbolic weight, too. Early exchanges are clipped, practical, focus on logistics. As the film deepens, the language becomes more reflective, even poetic at times, a sign that the characters are moving from reacting to thinking, from surviving to questioning. And in the final act, the words become sparse again, but in a different way, not from emotional repression, but from the understanding that some truths don't need to be spoken aloud to be shared. Even the pacing reflects the themes. The early sections feel almost leisurely, giving us space to breathe, to take in the world. Midway through, the rhythm tightens. Scenes cut quicker, dialogue overlaps, the camera moves more urgently. By the climax, we're in near constant motion, breathless and unmoored. And then, just as the resolution approaches, the film slows again, letting us feel the weight of what's been lost and what's been gained. It's like being pulled under a wave, tossed in the current, and then finally washed up on shore. What I find most haunting is how all these elements, the thresholds, the water, the broken objects, the red, converge in the ending. Without spoiling the specific beats, I'll say this. The final image ties every symbol together without spelling it out. You see the water, the light, the threshold, and you understand, maybe not in words, but in your bones, that this was never just a story about what happened. It was a story about what it costs to truly see the world as it is, and the choice we face once we do. And that's the beauty of it. The film doesn't hand you a moral in clean block letters. It leaves you with images, sounds, and sensations that you carry with you afterward. You might find yourself days later thinking about that bird over the field, or that red scarf caught on a fence, and realizing they were saying something to you all along, something you might not have been ready to hear in the moment, but that's been quietly working its way into you ever since. All right, let's pull back the curtain and talk about how this story was told, because the machinery of the film is every bit as fascinating as its characters or themes. The first thing I'll say is this. You can feel the director's hand in every frame, but never in a way that's showy or desperate for attention. It's the kind of filmmaking that trusts the audience to notice, rather than shouting for them to look. When I watched it the first time, I remember thinking, this feels like it's breathing. Scenes aren't forced into an artificial rhythm. They expand and contract naturally, like the lungs of a living thing. That's deliberate. The camera work is a big part of that. The cinematographer clearly understands emotional gravity of perspective. We're often low to ground, looking up at landscapes that dwarf the characters, a reminder of their smallness against the vast, indifferent forces around them. Other times, the camera sits right at eye level, giving us the intimacy of being there in the space between breaths. There's also a restraint to movement. Even during chaos, the camera glides rather than jerks, which makes the tension feel inevitable instead of accidental. One thing I noticed early on was the use of long takes. Not in a look at me, I'm technically impressive way some directors use them, but in a way that lets us inhabit a moment without the artificial interruption of cuts. You feel the awkwardness of a pause in conversation. You feel the slow turn of someone deciding whether to speak. There's power in that kind of patience. It forces you to live in the world rather than skipping through it. Lighting is another storytelling tool here, maybe even more than dialogue. Natural light dominates, with the cinematographer leaning into the soft grays of overcast skies and the pale gold of late afternoon. When artificial light appears, it's purposeful, lanterns casting trembling shadows, or the cold, clinical glare of an overhead bulb that turns faces into something almost alien. Light isn't just about seeing here. It's about feeling. And then there's a color palette, muted, earthy, almost drained at times. The absence of bright color gives more weight to the few moments when it does appear. That pop of red in a scarf. The faint green of moss after rain. It's a trick on the eye. By holding back, the film makes the smallest visual change feel monumental. Editing-wise, this film plays a long game. It resists the temptation to cut rapidly in action scenes, trusting instead in geography and timing to create tension. You always know where you are, who's moving toward what, and how far away danger is. The cuts come with kind of invisible logic. They're dictated by the rhythm of what's happening rather than by some arbitrary need for speed. Sound design might be the most underrated element here, and it's doing quiet, brilliant work. Ambient noise is allowed to breathe. The creak of old wood, the whisper of wind and grass, the distant rumble of something you can't see. There's a scene where two characters speak in low voices, but the sound of a nearby river is almost louder than their words, and that's intentional. It tells you something about their relationship without them ever having to say it. The score is used sparingly, almost like a rare spice. You can go entire stretches with no music at all, and then a few notes will slip in, minor chords on a piano, a deep drone on the soundscape, and suddenly your chest tightens without knowing why. When the music does swell, it's not to tell you what to feel, but to deepen what you're already feeling. One of the boldest filmmaking choices is the film's relationship to perspective. We're not given a God's eye view of events. Instead, the camera often stays with characters' line of sight, limiting what we know to what they know. In moments of danger, this means we see only flickers of movement or shadow, which is infinitely more unsettling than a full reveal. In quieter moments, it means we catch the same fleeting beauty the characters do. A bird overhead, a shaft of light breaking through cloud cover. There's also an interesting relationship between stillness and motion. Static shots are used for conversations or moments of contemplation, anchoring us in the present. But when the world outside intrudes, a storm breaking, an unseen force moving in, the camera moves, sometimes slowly tracking, sometimes circling, as if to remind us that stillness is never permanent. One of my favorite techniques in the film is the use of layered sound. In certain scenes, you'll hear something faint in the background, a hum, a low rumble, a rhythmic tapping. That doesn't immediately register. Only later do you realize it was foreshadowing, a sonic breadcrumb pointing toward what's coming. It's subtle enough that you can miss it on the first viewing, but once you know, you can't unhear it. From a production standpoint, there's an elegance to how resources were used. This isn't a film that leans on extravagant set pieces. Instead, it invests in textures, the weatherwood of a doorframe, the mud clinging to boots, the way fabric folds in shifting wind. These details, captured with precision, give the world a tactile reality that even the most expensive CGI can't replicate. Speaking of CGI, when it's used here, it's practically invisible. Digital effects are blended with practical ones in a way that keeps you grounded. A distant skyline might be digitally altered to suggest something uncanny, but because it's layered over a real horizon, your mind accepts it without question. Box office performance, in this case, is interesting because it reflects the kind of slow-burn reputation the film built. Opening numbers weren't explosive. This wasn't designed to be a weekend phenomenon. But word of mouth, particularly from critics and film communities that value craft over spectacle, gave it legs. It held steady week after week, drawing audiences who might have skipped it in favor of flashier titles at first. By the time it left theaters, it had quietly outperformed expectations, especially internationally, where its themes resonated with diverse cultural contexts. What's fascinating is that its financial success mirrors its narrative arc. Just as the story builds quietly and deliberately before hitting its emotional peak, the film's box office presence grew steadily rather than exploding out of the gate. It didn't need a marketing blitz to force it into conversation. People kept talking about it because it stayed with them. I think that a direct result of the filmmaking techniques we've been talking about, the restraint, the patience, the refusal to spell everything out, these choices create an experience that lingers. When a film trusts you, you tend to reward it. You return for a second viewing. You recommend it to friends who appreciate the same kind of slow burn artistry. You start noticing new details you missed before, and that deepens your attachment. And maybe that's the real magic here. The film doesn't just tell a story. It builds a relationship with its audience. It says, I'm going to show you something, but you're going to have to meet me halfway. And when you do, it's deeply satisfying. You feel like you've been part of something crafted with care, where every sound, every cut, every frame was there for a reason. That, to me, is the mark of great filmmaking. Not just technical mastery, but the wisdom to know when to hold back, when to let silence speak, when to let shadow hide, and when to finally open the floodgates and let everything rush in. All right, let's sink into this part of the story, because if the filmmaking was a skeleton, the cast is absolutely the heartbeat, and the way the cast talks about their work, the way audiences have responded to them. Well, it's not just industry chatter. It's the sort of conversation you'd overhear late at night, maybe over coffee with a friend who's just seen something that shook them. The thing about this ensemble is that it feels inevitable, as if they were meant to find each other in this exact combination, at this exact moment in their careers. You know how sometimes you watch a film and think, yeah, they're acting well, but I can see the acting? Not here. Not even for a breath. It's the sort of casting that makes you wonder whether the director had them in mind before the script was even finished. Not because it's true, but because the fit is so seamless you can't imagine anyone else stepping into these shoes. When I sat down to listen to some of the interviews, I was expecting the usual press junket politeness. You know, the smiles that don't quite reach the eyes, the repeated talking point about how much of a family we became. And yes, they did say those words at times, but here's the thing. They meant them. You could tell in the small ways. The way one actor would finish another's thought, not interrupt, but because they already knew where it was going. The way they glance at each other after a shared memory, with a kind of grin you can't fake, because it's rooted in a specific moment only they were there to witness. One of the most surprising things I learned from these conversations was how much of the film's emotional texture came from rehearsal, and I don't mean just running lines in a room. The director had the cast live together, in character, for a short stretch before shooting began. Not as a stunt, but as a way of steeping them in the rhythms of each other's presence. They cooked meals together, argued over chores, walked the nearby streets as if they truly lived in that world. By the time cameras rolled, they didn't have to pretend familiarity. It was already baked into every glance and every overlapping line of dialogue. And some of the performances were deeply personal in ways that only became clear after fact. One cast member revealed that a particular scene, the kind where everything seems to hang in the air, trembling, mirrored a real loss in their own life. They didn't go into detail, but you could see it in their eyes while they spoke. It's rare to hear an actor admit they weren't just drawing from character backstory, but from lived grief from the sharp, unfixable kind. When the scene plays in the film, it's haunting in a way you can't quite name until you know the truth. What's fascinating is how different members of the cast approach their work. One is famously meticulous, with pages of notes about motivations and subtext, never content to just feel it. They need to map it out. Another works entirely on instinct, leaning into whatever comes in the moment. Normally, those two approaches might clash, but here they created a balance. Precision meeting unpredictability. It's like watching someone draw a perfect circle and another person throw paint at it. Together, they made something neither could have done alone. Of course, audiences picked up on all this, even if they didn't know exactly why. I remember reading early viewer reviews after premiere, and the word authentic kept appearing. Not realistic, exactly. Because realism can still feel cold but authentic, as in I believe this person exists outside the frame. One review said something like, "It's the first time in years I forgot I was watching actors." That's high praise in any language. What I found equally interesting is how the cast engaged the audience after release. Instead of vanishing once the promotional circuit was over, they leaned into the conversation. They showed up at smaller screenings, not just the high-profile events, and actually sat through the film with regular audiences. Then they'd stay unhurried to answer questions. Not the quick, "we got 5 minutes" type of Q&A, but long, Open exchanges where they'd share little behind-the-scenes moments you'd never get from a press kit. And it's in those moments that the mythology of the film really deepens. One actor told a story about a take where something unexpected happened. A prop broke mid-scene, and instead of cutting, the director told him to keep going. The crack in the object startled everyone, and the silence that followed was completely unscripted. That silence made it into Final Cut, and it's one of the most tension-heavy beats in the whole film. Audiences love that kind of thing because it makes them feel like co-conspirators in the magic. Not every reaction was glowing, of course. A few viewers felt the pacing drag in places, that the quietness was too quiet. But what struck me was how the cast handled those critiques. In interviews, they didn't get defensive. They nodded, considered, even agreed in some cases. One said, "I think that's fair. We made a deliberate choice to let things breathe, but it's not going to land for everyone. That's okay." There's a humility in that, a recognition that art isn't about pleasing everyone. It's about making a thing you believe in and accepting how it's received. From a broader perspective, the audience's connection with the cast seems to be about more than just the performances. It's about the honesty in how they speak about the work. There's no illusion that this film was effortless to make. They talk about the days that felt impossible, the lines that wouldn't come, the scenes that demanded retake after retake. And because they're candid about the difficulty, the triumphs feel more earned. I can't tell you how many times I've gone back to watch certain scenes just to study the micro-choices. A pause, a look, the way a line is thrown away rather than emphasized. It's the sort of acting that invites you to lean in rather than spoon-feeding you every beat. You want to catch the small things because you sense they matter, even if you can't articulate why right away. What's beautiful is that audience reviews reflect the same sense of discovery. I've seen people say, "I didn't notice this the first time, but on my second viewing I caught the way her hand moves right before she speaks, and it changes the whole scene." That's the mark of performances with layers. They keep giving long after you've seen them once. And I think that's why, months after release, the conversation around the cast hasn't died down. They become almost inseparable from the world of the film in the public imagination. People don't just talk about the plot. They talk about that moment when a certain character's voice cracks, or when someone's eyes flicker for just half a second before they answer. Those moments aren't in the script. They're born in the space between words, where actors breathe life into a line and make it their own. Even now, thinking back on the interviews, I'm struck by how much mutual respect there is within the ensemble. There's no one trying to outshine the others. If anything, they seem invested in making sure everyone comes across at their best. One actor mentioned that during a particularly emotional scene, the camera wasn't even on them, but they gave a performance as if it was, because they wanted their scene partner to have the most honest reaction possible. That kind of generosity doesn't always make headlines, but you feel it in the work. And maybe that's why the audience reviews read less like Consumer Reports and more like love letters. They talk about how the film stayed with them, how certain exchanges or silences felt personal, almost uncomfortably so. A lot of viewers mention watching it with someone else, a friend, a partner, and then sitting in quiet afterwards, unsure what to say. That's when you know a performance has hit home, when it leaves you a little bit stunned, and not in a way you can easily unpack. What I take away from all of this is that the relationship between the cast and the audience didn't end when the credits rolled. It became a conversation, not just about the story, but about the craft, the choices, the risks. It's rare for that conversation to feel this alive months later, but here it is, still unfolding, still pulling new people in. And honestly, that's the best kind of legacy a film can have. Not just box office numbers or awards, though those may come, but the simple fact that people can't stop talking about it. And not because they were told to, but because they want to, because it made them feel something real, and they're grateful for the people who made that possible. You know, when I think back to where we started this conversation, it feels like we've been on a journey together, not just through the story that unfolded on screen, but through the textures, the shadows, the silences, and the sparks that made it something more than a film. We wandered into the heart of the plot, peeling back the layers of what happened and how it made us feel. We met the characters not as names on a casting sheet, but as living, breathing people whose choices and flaws kept us leaning forward. We pulled the curtain back on the strange, almost unbelievable facts of its making, and I can still picture those moments. The broken prop that changed the scene forever, the unplanned glance that became the soul of an entire sequence. We walked through the film like travelers in a city we didn't know we loved until we were already lost in it. The setting, the cinematography, the deliberate use of shadow and stillness. It wasn't just background. It was part of the conversation the film was having with us. Even the sound design, with its moments of sharp intrusion and others of aching absence, became part of the storytelling. It's one of those rare experiences where every element fell in conversation with every other. The camera speaking to the actors, the lighting speaking to theme, the setting speaking to the emotional heartbeat. And those themes, we didn't just glance at them, we lived in them for a while. The symbolism wasn't just a clever academic exercise. It was the lifeblood of the narrative. Every visual motif, every recurring image, felt like a breadcrumb trail for us to follow, leading us deeper into the ideas the film dared to wrestle with. It didn't just show us conflict. It asked us what we would do if it were ours. It didn't just give us characters to root for or against. It blurred the line, made us feel the unease of loving and fearing someone in the same breath. And then there was a craft. The filmmaking choices that you only notice when you lean in close. The long takes that dared you to sit with discomfort. The editing that cut away at the exact moment your mind wanted to linger, forcing you to imagine what wasn't shown. The way the camera didn't just observe, but seemed to have an opinion. Moving not like a machine, but like an unspoken narrator with its own biases and curiosities. Behind the scenes, we saw how that vision came to life. Not effortlessly, but with the kind of stubborn devotion that keeps a crew working through setbacks and uncertainties. The little victories. Nailing an impossible shot, catching lightning in a bottle when a rehearsal moment was better than a planned one. Those are the things you feel even if you don't know they're there. And we've talked about the people who made it happen, both in front of and behind the camera, and how their dedication went beyond doing the job into something like stewardship, carrying the film's soul in their hands. The reception, that ongoing conversation between audience and art, might be one of my favorite parts. Not because everyone agreed they didn't, but because people cared. They wrote about it, argued about it, recommended it to friends, and came back for second viewings just to notice the things they missed the first time. That's when you know something has found its place. Not in the box office charts, but in the living memory of the people who've seen it. And if I'm being honest, that's why I make these deep dives with you. It's not about declaring something good or bad, or tallying up its strengths and weaknesses like a scorecard. It's about sitting together in the afterglow or aftershock of a film and saying, let's not rush away from this. Let's see how far down it goes. Because when you give art that kind of time and attention, it tends to give something back. Something personal, something you didn't expect to find. I think that's what this one did for me. It reminded me that cinema isn't just about telling a story. It's about making you feel like you've been somewhere and lived something you couldn't in your own life. And if you're anything like me, you'll find pieces of yourself in the unlikeliest places, in a fleeting glance and a half-heard line, in the quiet between two explosions of sound. So as we wrap up, I just want to say thank you, genuinely, for walking through this with me. For not just watching the film, but for watching closely, for being the kind of audience that isn't afraid to wrestle with ideas, to notice the things in the corners of the frame, to talk about what a film means rather than just what it does. That's rare, and it's why I think of you all not just as viewers, but as fellow travelers in this ongoing adventure through cinema. If you've been here for a while, you know this part, the gentle nudge I give at the end. If you found something here worth thinking about, or if you just like the way we take our time with these explorations, then I'd love it if you'd subscribe. Not because numbers matter more than the work, they don't, but because it means we get to keep having these conversations. It means next time there's a film that grabs us by the collar and won't let go, you'll be right here with me, digging into it until we've turned it inside out. And if you want to go one step further, share this with someone who loves film the way you do. Someone who won't mind spending an evening talking about why a single cut or a single note of music changed everything. Because those are the people who belong here. Those are the people who make the space feel alive. Until then, I'll leave you with this. Every great film leaves us with a question that's bigger than its own story. Sometimes we can answer it. Sometimes we can't. But the fact that we're still asking, that's the sign it was worth watching. And this one, oh, it was worth every second.